Welcome to It's a Woman's World, where we'll meet achieving women making a difference in our community. I am Carolyn Bruna. Our guest is Claudia Kalb, former senior writer for Newsweek magazine and New York Times best-selling author of the book, Andy Warhol Was a Hoarder, Inside the Minds of History's Great Personalities. Welcome, Claudia.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So many impressive things there that it took me a while to get them all straight.
Right.
But I'm really excited that you're here.
Thank you.
And we met at Bethesda Literary Festival in
Right.
Bethesda, Maryland.
Right.
Yeah,
What
so
a
that
wonderful
was fun.
place with lots of great authors and
Yeah.
readings and great place to meet.
It was an exciting day. It was very nice. Yeah. So, but three different things: a senior writer, New York Times bestselling author, and actually freelance writer.
Yes. So I was at Newsweek for 17 years, where I wrote about all sorts of issues, but mostly health, science, and medicine. And in 2011, the magazine was sold, and I decided I had always kind of wanted to see if I could set out on my own and freelance. And I was interested in writing a book at some point. So in 2011, I set out as a freelance writer, and along the way, had this great opportunity and developed this book. And it's been a wonderful few years since.
Yeah, it is. But I want to ask you, though, back to, were you always interested in writing? And was that your passion as a child, or how did you get into journalism?
It was my passion as a child. I really always loved words. It was the way I communicated. I was kind of a shy kid, and I loved to write and explore writing. And I remember I used to fall asleep at night and hear poetry and sentences in my head. Words were sort of my thing. And I used to read The New Yorker even before I could really understand the words. I would look at the cartoons and just hold this magazine. I loved the idea of being a writer.
Yes.
And so when I went into college, I became an English major. But I did always have an interest in science and medicine as well.
Oh, yeah. Were there any stepping stones as you were going and getting into your journalism and into Newsweek magazine?
Right.
And at the time, were there any barriers for women? I want to get right to the women's issue there. Yeah.
It was interesting. I did a graduate degree in, at college I worked on the school newspaper, so I got a little experience writing some stories. And in graduate school, I took classes in journalism and international affairs and was able to work for a couple of journalists as a researcher, which really gave me an initial grounding and just how to collect information and facts. And I started at Newsweek as a researcher at first, and I was kind of floating around different sections of the magazine, business and national news, and then what they call the back of the book, which is sort of lifestyle, and it was health and medicine. I was lucky to be starting at a time in the 1990s when there were women as role models. There were women in higher positions. Newsweek itself had gone through some interesting times, and there had been a lawsuit filed in 1970 to get women more into senior positions. So there was a history there that sort of set up a level of mentorship that was there, that I felt was there when I got there. And I really felt that there were people I could look up to in more senior positions, both men and women, who really supported me in my early years there, trying to kind of climb up and see what I could do. So I think I was really lucky to be entering there in the 90s at a time when I felt there were role models and mentors and people to help.
Well, that's wonderful. You know, on the show, as I interview people, a number of women do say that they've had mentors, and I always said I wish that I had a mentor, you know, through the years. I think it's a wonderful thing.
It is. And I think that young women especially should sort of look around and see, you know, set their sights on people that they can admire who have achieved, and see, you know, see about whether they can connect with these women, because I think a lot of women would love to have the opportunity to be mentors. They may not think of it for a certain person, but if that person comes to them, they may be very open to the idea. So it's something to keep your eyes out for, and then sort of take the next step of saying, could I talk to you? Could you share your experience? And be brave about it. Sometimes it can feel intimidating, but I think most women are really happy to talk and to share their experiences and to become mentors.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, then people have to learn to ask, which I didn't know about at the time, and I think today women are more savvy.
Yes.
Luckily, yeah, and more outgoing and you know, interested in saying that's
right.
I was going to ask you, and you've kind of the mentorship is probably one of them, but is one of the more rewarding things of working for Newsweek?
You know, it was a great experience. One thing was these great mentors and people to work with who I learned from. Writing for a national audience, so I was able to bring issues to light that people all over the country, and in some cases the world, were reading, and really important issues about science and health, illness, medicine. So I really felt like I was contributing in some way through my writing. And Newsweek gave me that great opportunity, and I really think that there were great editors, great people to bounce ideas off of. I liked the format of it in terms of it being a weekly magazine. For me, that was a good fit. Now things have changed so much. People are writing stories online all day long. I liked having the opportunity to delve in more deeply to a story. Sometimes it was a quick turnaround. It could be very quick, but in general there was a little more time to interview people, understand the topic, and then write it in a thoroughly researched way.
Yeah, that's good. I know in our family we used to subscribe.
Oh, okay.
And I love the fact that, you know, the magazine would come, and of course I would grab it and read. Of course I would read all the little, was it People or something more similar to the news people, you know, at the time first, and then on to the news.
Yeah, a nice variety of smaller stories and longer stories.
Yeah. And the medical ones, I hate to admit that I would leave them for later. Yeah. But how did you decide to specialize and then to and your specialty was health and medicine and science? Well, what gave you that? Well, I had that, impetus. I guess
I was interested in those areas. I always thought about writing as a kid. The other thing I thought about was being a pediatrician. I was interested. I love children, and I thought. I love the idea of maybe being a medical doctor for kids, but when I went to college and started taking the science classes, it just wasn't the greatest fit for me, and I felt as if my strength was on the writing side, and I ended up doing that through my English major. But then when I got to Newsweek, and I was working for a few years out of the bureau in Boston, and Boston is just filled with hospitals and medical centers and the leading experts, and I was able to contribute in that way by talking to and interviewing and writing stories and researching stories with all of these people there as these expert sources. And it just became more and more something I got interested in. And I felt like it could be my specialty versus something like politics, which would be another huge strength of a magazine like Newsweek. But there were so many leading journalists already covering that area, and I felt like I could make a difference in science and health. And it's such an important topic, and that's where I thought that my strengths would lie versus some of these other subject areas.
Yeah, it certainly is important, especially now in today's world, moving forward to today.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
It's one of the most important things.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, for young writers now, how would you recommend that they, or should they specialize, and how do they select something to specialize in?
Right.
And then for women, what are some of the specialties that you think might be good for them to go into to get jobs?
Right. Well, I think specializing can be very helpful if you come in with a foundation of a subject area. It doesn't mean you necessarily need to go get a master's degree in something, but to sort of carve out an area that interests you, if it's science or health, and you can work in that area maybe a little bit or do some reading and just come in with some basic understanding about the subject, it will make you a little more of an expert in the field. But that said, journalism is the kind of career, and this is what makes it so wonderful, that you have opportunities to learn on the job. And it's one of those great attributes of this career. You talk to experts all day long for your stories, so you can become somewhat of a specialist on the job. The critical elements, I would say, are just having a lot of motivation and drive, willingness to revise, your writing, to talk to a lot of people, to sort of just persevere. And you will learn so much through your work. And then at times you'll figure out, this area interests me, I don't really like reporting on that, and you can become a specialist more in one area. I think today the thing that's different than it was for me going in, what is that there's so much more online on film, so creating videos, being really savvy in social media. Those are all areas I think young women probably are already pretty good at. But it's an area that I would say if you can take a class in video editing or learning how to produce a story online, becoming pretty savvy in social media, having your own Twitter account or whatever it is where you're promoting ideas and work. If you can come into a job with that kind of experience already developed, I think it will give you a leg up. I think it's sort of required at this point. You can't just come in wanting to write.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I agree. It is, we're more encompassing because of the different media that people are reading and looking at, and of course computers and iPhones and iPads and just, you know, blogs, everything else like that. Yeah, it's important. And I guess, although I'm concentrating on women, it's women and men, really, isn't it, for everybody?
Right,
but,
women and men. And, you know, journalism, too, has different components. I mean, there's print journalism, magazine and newspaper, there's radio, and there's television. So each one of those is slightly different. I mean, the core of it is storytelling and being able to interview people, digest information, and produce a good story. But it's going to be a little bit different for each of those formats, and that's something you learn pretty much on the job. So the other thing I might suggest to people, which is sort of an age-old suggestion in journalism, is to start at a smaller place. Try to get a local job at your community newspaper or local newspaper. Get in there, intern, and get a feel for it at the smaller level, and then you can advance up with more experience.
Oh, that's great. Interview, digest, and produce. Just write those things. I love it. That's really good. Thank you. I wanted to just ask you about the article on Genius that you wrote for National Geographic.
Right.
And just give me something that you feel people should learn from. And from that, I don't know if this is next, I ask about how we promote female geniuses. But first, tell me just a little bit about your Genius article.
Well, genius is such an interesting concept. Everybody wants to know what makes a genius. How did that brain, you know, produce these incredible artworks or do that kind of math that none of us seem to understand? And so my job was to really try to get at the core elements of genius. What attributes come together? And there were some really interesting lessons learned. One is that IQ is not the only thing, and it's not always that important. So you could have a really high IQ, but not necessarily succeed. So it can be, intelligence matters, but you don't have to be the smartest person in the room. Grit and determination and motivation are really important. So you have to have that ability to stick to it. I also learned some interesting things about creativity, that the ideas that could be those big ideas don't necessarily come by force. You can't think I'm going to come up with some great new idea. Creativity requires some level of taking information in and allowing your brain to kind of simmer with food in a pot, and just have those ideas simmer to the point that then the bigger aha or eureka moment happens. So you can't force it. You need to give that time to brew. And then another really interesting aspect is that luck matters. So you could be born during the Renaissance and be Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci. You could be born into poverty, and then you don't get the chance to become a genius. So there's interesting qualities about it. Some you can control to some degree, but a lot of them you can't control.
That is so amazing. My mom was having an operation a number of years ago, and this doctor turned out to be a well-known surgeon, and I was so excited that he was doing the operation. I mentioned that to him because you're so well-known, and he said, yes, and he says, all that experience is wonderful, and the technique, of course, but luck really plays a part. And I was shocked that a physician and a surgeon would say that, and you're so right now as well in Genius.
That's so interesting.
I know, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let's just go with how to promote and create female geniuses.
Right.
Is there a way, do you think?
Well, I think part of it is sort of identifying and looking out for young girls whose minds are busy with ideas, and just being able to acknowledge that and provide opportunities. Because the other thing about Genius is that the surrounding environment matters. So if you have parents who recognize a passion and help support it and develop it, that can be very helpful. there's a point at which too much can be a problem, but to be able to support talent in girls and provide mentors for young girls, give them opportunities to learn from older girls or women who have succeeded in a career like science or math or art or literature. So really to sort of be on the lookout, provide opportunities, nourish that interest and ability, allow the passion to sort of take the child. They talk about with kids, there can be sort of this drive to create that in a genius level person is just almost unstoppable. It's just sort of this intense drive, and to recognize that and allow it to flourish.
Wow, well, that's amazing. Thank you. We'll talk more about your book, and we'll start in the second half.
Okay, great.
We'll return after this short public service announcement.
They said I have troll teeth.
That my voice sounded like a possessed baby doll.
That no one would ever love someone as stupid as me.
That I was fat, ugly.
Disgusting.
The effect of bullying is potent.
We will no longer be the silent majority.
Now, when you see online bullying, there's something you can do about it.
We're gonna take action with the I.
I am a witness.
I am a witness.
I am a witness.
I am a witness.
I am a witness, and so are you.
Welcome back to It's a Woman's World. We're speaking with Claudia Kalb, journalist and author. Claudia, I'd like to talk about your book this half, and it's Inside the Minds of History's Great Personalities. Of course, it starts with Andy Warhol was a hoarder, Inside the Minds of History's Great Personalities. So I know you've mentioned 12 people there. Besides Andy Warhol being a hoarder, there's Princess Diana. I do remember the bulimia.
Yes.
And Betty Ford.
Right.
And her addictions. And Marilyn Monroe, and you're going to have to name some other people for me, because I had to look them up as I was writing this question.
I mean, I sometimes have to refer to all 12 in the book, but there are everyone from Warhol, as is the title feature, through to Howard Hughes, Abraham Lincoln, Frank Lloyd Wright, Christine Jorgensen, Charles Darwin, George Gershwin, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Albert Einstein. So all of those names come together, and each chapter is a sort of a psychological profile of that person. So you mentioned Princess Diana, who struggled with bulimia, which is an eating disorder. And in that I sort of study her, what she talked about in terms of her childhood. She had a difficult childhood, the child of divorce, and how this may have affected her and what led to this eating disorder that she talked openly about, which is really remarkable. And as with Betty Ford and addiction, and Betty Ford really came out and talked publicly and helped so many women and other people with this problem by founding the Betty Ford Center and supporting treatment. Some of the cases were less about the person being diagnosed, but theories about the person from mental health experts who sort of had looked at their case history and said, I think, for example, with Lincoln, and they said, I think he may have been suffering from depression. Lincoln was known to be a very melancholy guy. So I took that information from the experts and kind of dove into his story, and then looked at the studies that had been written about him, talked to experts in the field, and really developed these profiles to kind of examine the question of what drove their behaviors, what was going on inside their minds. In some cases, they were such geniuses. How did they balance some struggles with some incredible achievements? And I learned so much about these 12 incredible people.
It is amazing. And it's amazing to think that years later, through history, I guess doctors and researchers, and I really loved reading your introduction because it was explaining that, and I kept thinking, well, these are diagnoses, but you can't say they exactly had these particular maladies. And what were they as children, as you were saying, that needing to be encouraged and mentored, and also the fact that if they had the medicines back then, who was it who wrote something, and would he have written that, composed that?
Right,
was it, Leonard Bernstein?
Yeah, it's George Gershwin.
No, George Gershwin, yes, Rhapsody in Blue.
Yeah.
Right, I thought that was so amazing. Yeah, if he had been put on Ritalin, would he still have been able to do that kind of thing?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, because George Gershwin has been, I heard a very interesting expert in both psychiatry and music talk about George Gershwin. His name is Dr. Richard Kogan, and he was giving a performance and saying Gershwin's childhood behaviors are reminiscent of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder today. And had he been pulled out from kindergarten, let's say, and assessed and diagnosed and possibly put on a medication, how would it have affected his life? What would have happened? There are a lot of really interesting questions, and I think by the end, I came away feeling like there really are no absolutes in any of this. Sometimes a diagnosis is incredibly helpful. Sometimes it may not be. Sometimes medicine is really helpful. Sometimes it doesn't help. So there's a lot of, there's no black and white. Mental health and the brain are really complex, and that's what makes it also interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And to you, who was your most interesting personality?
It's really hard to pick a favorite. It's like asking your favorite child. But I think I kind of found an affinity with Darwin in the sense that, not for his such brilliant ideas, but just in the sense that he was a writer, a scientist writing about science. And he had a lot of very sort of kinds of qualities about his anxiety. He struggled with anxiety. It's what I wrote about in the book. And these kinds of symptoms of nervousness and sort of headaches and stomach aches and a perfectionism quality about his work. I really identify with that to some degree. A lot of writers, I think, would identify with that. And he was a really ethical guy, which I really admired the way he handled some of the competition in the field. So I would say he was one of the people I really enjoyed kind of bonding with through this experience of writing. But they were all so interesting. Each one had a unique quality and personality and achievement that I really learned from.
What point are you making that you want people to learn about?
You know, it's a great question because the book goes through into all of this detail, and the ultimate point, one of the big ones, is by being open about these kinds of mental health conditions, these kinds of difficulties that we all struggle with. A lot of these symptoms in some degree. It's all in a spectrum. But by talking about them publicly, we can connect and chip away at stigma around mental health. So I think it humanizes these very famous people. We can identify with them and realize we're not alone in any of this, that throughout history and throughout population now, a lot of people struggle with symptoms of some sort that can sometimes get them down or cause impediments, but there are ways to get through it, and you can accomplish great, wonderful things. So I found that very rewarding.
And how do people learn things about that, you know, that they should be learning about your book? What do they do to learn
further beyond what the book? I mean, there's a lot of scientific information in the book, so they can learn a lot about each condition, each one from depression with Lincoln to Princess Diana and bulimia. Marilyn Monroe, borderline personality disorder. People think that was what she struggled with. So they can learn from the descriptions in the book, from the qualities of the person profiled. And then in the back of the book, I have a very rich library, basically, of source material. So everything that I looked at and read, for the most part, I couldn't even include it all. There's a lot of links in the back of the book.
Yeah, and we're talking about audiences. So how now you're speaking to audiences, and how do you find that different? And are you engaging with the readers on a different level?
It's fun because as a writer, you're often in your own head, in your own space, working really hard by yourself to get through the material and to write. And I'm really finding speaking to audiences and engaging with readers is so rewarding. It's so interesting to meet people. I love the fact that people are out there reading books and still engaging with the printed word. I hear a lot of stories from people who come up after talks and tell me about family members who are struggling with one of these conditions, and I think they like the idea of actually being able to discuss it. And so it's a really wonderful experience after sort of a solitary experience to be able to then go out and engage with people, talk to people, talk about ideas. I really enjoy it.
Yeah. I can see the dichotomy or the differences in coming to talk, and that's nice. Yeah, I'm glad. Because you know what's interesting though too. It's inside the minds of great personalities. And it's personalities, because sometimes I've been mentioning this to people. Oh, I'm interviewing Claudia Kalb, and I was excited. And then when I'd mention Marilyn Monroe, they said, well, she's not a genius. Why is she there? But it's more the personality quirk.
Yes. I mean, I never intended starting the book that these would be geniuses, per se. The idea was famous people we think we know, and we do know at some level, but but famous people, figures, historic figures who provided something to the world. I mean, Marilyn Monroe's acting and her whole essence left a real mark on the world. And so she's in there as somebody who really had such a different identity off stage versus on stage. She was the glamour girl on stage, and people responded to the way she looked and the way she acted. But off stage, she was very troubled, and she really suffered throughout her life. So she's such a great example, almost a tragic example of how people's lives can be not what you think, and that she felt comfortable on stage. That was where she was able to act and sort of be this glamorous person, but off stage she really struggled. So she's in there not as a genius per se in the traditional sense, but as a historical figure who really made an impact on the world in some way, but had a deeper story to tell.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the difference between a quirk and an actual personality disorder, you know, and the continuum, and where one starts or ends and the other begins.
Yes, there's a lot to say about that.
Wow,
because
it's amazing.
Sometimes it is just a quirk. But when it really affects a person's life, and there are multiple behavioral symptoms that add up, it can really become a situation where help can be very much useful in getting that person to move forward, to not always be cured, but figure out ways to get to the point where they have skills and coping mechanisms. In the case of Marilyn Monroe, that condition, it's not about treating it with medicine, borderline personality disorder, it's more about coping mechanisms. So people can move forward.
How can people get in touch with you if they'd like more information or?
The best place is my website, because there's a form on there for contacting. It comes directly to me, and it's www.claudiakalb.com.
Great. And leave us with one or two of the most important things that you would think young women should know if they want to go into journalism.
First of all, just trust your inner voice and your instincts. I think people, especially young women, often second-guess themselves. And be confident in yourself, and be sort of kind to yourself. Don't get down on yourself. You can succeed even if you're not a really outgoing, extroverted person. This was something I always wondered. If you're on the quiet side, you can still go into journalism and succeed. So be confident in what you bring, and then be willing to really learn from the experienced people you encounter, to work hard and to be very open to reworking. I mean, journalism is all about learning, writing, but then revising. And I think be open to, your work gets better and better as you work at it. So to be open to all of that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed interviewing you.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope you've enjoyed meeting our guest, Claudia Kalb, as much as I have, and you'll start reading more books by women writers. If you know a woman who's gone above and beyond to contribute to our community, please email us. We're womansworldtv@aol.com. Remember, it's a woman's world. I'm Carolyn Bruna. See you next time.